Hey guys, welcome back. Let's talk about how to make you as conscious as possible. People love to be positive and say, oh, everything's getting better. Everything's going to be fine. I don't know if that's true. I am not sure whether everything's going to be fine. What I do know is that the more aware you are of your psyche, of your entire psyche, your conscious, your unconscious, the better things will go for you, generally speaking. I do know that for a fact. I mean, whether there's some cosmic plan of the universe and it's all going in, some grand God's plan, I don't know about that. But what I do know is that the more conscious you are, the more likely that your life is going to go in whatever direction you want it to go in, whatever direction you really want it to go in, not just what you want it to go in to avoid pain in the present moment. You need a religious experience, really. I mean, that's what you need. You need to find a spirit world. You need a spiritual experience, a small r religious experience. You need to connect with something beyond you that, I was about to say manipulates, that changes, that helps you to create a better relationship with yourself. I mean, that's what we're going for. How do we deconstruct this process to become ever more conscious? Now, we've already done it with sexuality. I mean, right? Go back to 100 years, and I think we'll get to it later today. We've already done it with sexuality. There was this part of humanity that we were aware of. I mean, why do you think those Victorian women were wearing the gowns that they did? I mean, I'm watching this documentary on Ken Burns National Parks, and these old pictures from the 19th century of tourists going to Yellowstone, and all the women have these Victorian gowns on. It just looks kind of silly. The men look a little bit less silly because they're wearing suits. I mean, they're wearing blazers. You just couldn't go outside. You could get arrested if you went outside in the 19th century and didn't have some kind of blazer and some kind of, derby hat or a newsboy hat kind of thing. Why were they doing that? Why were they wearing clothes like that? Of course. Sexuality. They were, in a sense, admitting that sexuality is really powerful. That's why they need to repress it. It's not like sexuality wasn't part of culture, but it was just more repressed. Of course, there's all the stigma around, children out of wedlock, having sex out of wedlock. But I think what Freud did that was really important, and okay, I guess we're going to get to it later, but he just kind of took out this thing that was a complex for a lot of people, and let's just expand it out. I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but let's just expand it out so we can be more comfortable with it now. 100 years later, we go, hey, you need a sexual experience. I mean, I think we all agree on that. It's really important for your psychological health. Even people who are religious would say that. And not just for having kids, not like doing the Catholic thing, having sex in a hole in a bedsheet, but it's important for your psychological health to at least connect with your wife in that way. I think we needed to do the same thing with consciousness, and I hope what I can do on this podcast is kind of extrapolate that out, extrapolate what that means. Do for consciousness what Freud did for sexuality. I mean, nothing is more, you think race issues are sensitive in academia now, humanities academia, specifically psychology. Yeah, it is kind of restricted what you can say, but almost what's as restricted, or maybe even more restricted in certain contexts, is talking about consciousness, perhaps even free will, like it's a real thing, without any religious connotation. And you can't do that. I mean, people, it's kind of like when I was in Korea and I tried to bring up the facelift. How it's just very common for people to get a facelift. I tried to bring it up to the family. It wasn't a family. It was like a group of people at this university who were hosting us, and it's not like they said no, that's no big deal, or we don't talk about that. I could just tell. I could see their eyes glaze over right, when you bring up. So why are these women getting facelifts? That's just like a normal thing. Anyway, it's just these parts of our culture. I'm not criticizing Korean culture. All cultures have these blind spots, some of them much bigger than others. Not saying all cultures are equal, but so that's what we need to do here. I want to talk about my trip this past weekend because there's this other interesting part of it that I think is worthy to talk about, and I think probably one of the most striking parts of our trip, aside from getting in car trouble, which I talked about in the video this past week, but probably even a more striking part is that my wife and I, we didn't fight. We did not fight on vacation. which is usually a thing for us. Now, if we're going to look at the relationship objectively, you could say it's, Mark, it's really you doing the fighting. It's you not, just picking at little things. Just like noticing things and saying things that I probably wouldn't say that, I don't really need to be said. I think it's really important to express needs, but everything that comes in your mind, you don't need to express, like all the way, down to, where your wife puts the water bottle when you're driving in the car, just things like that. I think it's something, it's a common sentiment, right? We always fight on vacation. It's just in us that I think we do this. Well, I think it was canonized probably most importantly in the Simpsons episode Mountain of Madness, right? That's what Smithers says to Mr. Burns. We always fight on vacation. And I think getting into the car crash is maybe part of the reason why we didn't fight. It's a good, not car crash, just car trouble. It wouldn't start. You can go back and watch the video this week. It doesn't matter. Just the car wouldn't start. We fixed it. It was fine. I think it's a good relationship advice that you would hear. We can always criticize Manosphere and Red Pill, how they're just like these tuned out guys who, I can see just in some of their tweets that's like, oh boy, this could be bad. If some event comes across this guy's life and everything he's saying in the tweet is 100% correct, but if I could just tell, if a certain event kind of blindsides this guy in a certain way, it's not going to be good for him. He's kind of going to go off the rails here. But, all that being said, I think there's really great advice that, now when I talk to guys in therapy, I don't have to coach them up on certain relationship dynamics. One of those dynamics that I think just people or guys get now that, I don't know, maybe in the 90s, I was kind of young and didn't date a lot in the 90s, late bloomer, right? Maybe in the 90s guys didn't get. I watch old Seinfeld episodes and I'm thinking, I know Seinfeld's, it's supposed to be funny, so whatever. But I'm just like, maybe in the 90s, like, guys just didn't get that. You need a purpose before your relationship. And that's really important, not just for you, but for the health of the relationship. That's the relationship dynamic. The man is the stabilizing force, and the woman is the soul, in a sense. I said that in a tweet. Right, lame, but true. It's true. Man is the stabilizing force. Woman provides the psychic, the emotional energy in a relationship. So if a man is a stabilizing force, how could he put the woman first? How could she trust him to the fullest extent? I'm sure she could still trust him to some extent, but how could he trust him to the fullest extent if he is putting her first? And guys won't do this consciously, of course. I would argue I would do this unconsciously, like looking for a woman's approval, looking for a woman's validation. That's why I think sexual initiation, to go through that. Podcast, I talk about it a bunch. I'll probably end up talking about it a lot here on this podcast, but just going through that sexual initiation is really important to inure you to a woman's validation of your sexuality, which is what, of course, most guys are sensitive about. I'm not talking about penis size. I'm talking about, does your sexuality have the right to exist, in the presence of a woman? Well, when you're, at a bus stop or, somewhere at a mall or, I don't know, at a restaurant, wherever, and you walk by a woman who you think is attractive and looks interesting to you, and you don't talk to her, I would say the implication of that is, well, maybe my sexuality is fine in a certain context, but here it just doesn't have the right to exist. So I think it's important to talk to that girl, not just to meet her, because she might be a very interesting, a lovely person, but for later on when you're in a relationship, because, women, God bless them, they will test you. They will just break you down to your fundamental fibers. And if you're not comfortable with that, as indicated by walking by that girl at the bus stop, then, the relationship's going to be so much more difficult. Like I always say, you think approaching women stops when you get a girlfriend or a wife? No, it becomes ever more important, because now you got to broach topics, you got to broach connections with this woman who, at a certain extent, who knows what's going on with her, right? So that's really good relationship advice. Have a mission, because how can a woman trust you without a mission? Now, I think there's a lot of emotional underpinnings to that, and you can't just choose to have a mission, right? Like I always say, that's a high value concept. That's a high value need. You got to get more basic needs met first, like just basic, emotional understanding of what you're going through, how to express emotions in a healthy way, so you don't come off like a wuss, which of course it is totally possible for you to come off like a wuss when expressing emotions. Well, you got to learn how to do it, and in order to learn how to do it, I think it's really important to learn the structure of emotions. But I think why couples fight, why I may tend to pick more fights on vacation with my wife, if I wasn't going to be totally honest, is because I think there's perhaps a more important purpose to having a purpose than just creating a stable relationship. Well, I guess this is part of it. You don't have a purpose to become more attractive to a woman. I think that's true. And if I think I say this in my book, I've said it a couple times. I mean, if I could just nail down what women want, or, I mean, ultimately it doesn't matter, right? Who cares? But if we had to say what women want, what is universally attractive to all women across all cultures, I would say a boundary. A man with a healthy boundary, with a healthy identity. Part of that is, I mean, a big part of that is having a purpose. But I think why couples fight on vacation, why maybe Smithers and Mr. Burns fight more on vacation, is what happens when you're on vacation. Right? The work, the purpose is taken away. And now you're used to using all this energy out in the environment, and now there's no place to put it. You don't wake up and work for 4 hours straight. You're not focused on your work or your business or your job, your career, anything like that. And it's just you going on a hike, or you driving in a car, or you camping. I mean, which is work to some degree. You got to do stuff, but I could just feel myself sometimes just pick at things, and it's like this energy. If you're going to say it euphemistically, you'd say, Mark is really intense. At my funeral, the eulogy, I'm going to say, Mark was an intense guy, but really what it is being annoying. It's just this incessant need to pick, and I can take that energy and I can put it out in work, or if I'm working on something, if I may be preparing for a podcast. But when that external species expected, I would argue, stimulus is taken away. It's like, okay, now I'm going to start criticizing where my wife's putting the water bottle in the car. And I can kind of feel myself doing it as I do it. It's like, oh, this is insane. But it's like this energy that just needs to keep going out. And I think that's really one of the unsung purposes of having a purpose, of having a mission. How are you supposed to live with somebody for the rest of your life to even have a chance of happiness if you have nothing to focus on besides them? It's what women want. I think it's what guys want too. I think you can come up with like a new foundational explanation for ethics. Like, how do you have ethics without God, right? That's the question. And I think the basis for doing that is looking at man's nature. Okay, what is it about man? What causes his survival? So, we could break down the ethics of any animal. We could break down the ethics of a tiger. Okay, what's a tiger? Okay, well, they're territorial, they eat meat. So, a part of an ethical code, you could argue, for a tiger. Not that I think they have a soul or free will or anything. But if you had a humanize animals, like we tend to do, I think there's a reason for that. Anyway, if you had to humanize this tiger, you would say, okay, your ethical code is to defend your territory, eat some meat, find some animal that you can eat, and kind of mark off your territory so when a female comes in, you can mate with her. In a sense, rape her, because that's what all sex in nature is. And I think we can do the same thing with man. We can look at just fundamental principles of our nature and come up with, well, what would be a good way to act based on that? Like, another way to do it would be, what is ultimately gratifying to the opposite sex? Ultimately. And I think having this kind of boundary, this sort of identity, I would argue is, the ultimate aphrodisiac, honesty. And just being totally transparent, totally comfortable with who you are. It almost doesn't matter who you are. It does to some degree, of course, but it almost doesn't matter who you are across different cultures. This guy just knows what he is, and I may not agree with all of it, but, that's what a woman's thinking. And it's almost like, because I would argue that is the ultimate aphrodisiac, that is what men ultimately want. Not because it's the ultimate aphrodisiac, but you have to make some evolutionary argument here about the symbiotic development of male and female and mammalian species. Like, yeah, that's probably a pretty good indication. Not what women say they want in polite society, this or that. Because then, ultimate ethical code for me, I'm going to be doing the dishes. Which I'm not saying women don't want guys to do the dishes. I understand how... But they don't even want guys to do the dishes, right? That's not what's important. What's important is them feeling supported. Right? Maybe part of what that means to them is doing the dishes. Doesn't mean you have to do the dishes. Just understand when a woman's complaining, what she's complaining about often isn't what she's really complaining about. This isn't like to criticize women to say they're irrational, but we all do this. What we're talking about on the surface is not really what we're talking about. When I'm saying to my wife, hey, you gotta put the water bottle. No, you can't put the water bottle there because the sun's going to shine this way, and it's 3 p.m. So the sun's at this angle, and it's going to be 5 p.m., which means it's going to be at this angle, and I'm going to park the car this way. So you can't just leave the water bottle there. I mean, I'm not saying to change the water bottle. What I'm ultimately saying is, I need something to do. Let's go on a hike here because I'm gonna make your life really annoying. You can almost think about that as a foundation for ethics. It's almost like a form follows function. Like this is true. I mean, yeah, this is true in a sense because it just gets down to the base of what our human nature is. And I think sexuality, as Freud was talking about, right? Sexuality is a big part of that. Maybe like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. There's a lot of modernism in architecture. And I know we can always criticize modernism in architecture. I think when you see stuff on Twitter and guys who think that Gothic architecture from the 15th century is the most beautiful, and then they juxtapose that with modern architecture. The modern architecture they choose is, of course, always the ugliest kind, which I wouldn't even argue is modern. It's just plastic crap stapled to something. And then there's postmodern, which is different. And we just kind of conflate those two in thought and in art and in architecture. But I would argue, this is an argument I get from the Fountainhead, I would argue that something like Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, which I think are just objectively, pleasing to the eye, just objectively handsome. I would say they're objectively handsome because it's functional. Because this guy, it just teased apart every aspect of this house that he was building. And he built it for that environment, like falling water, right? Like he put, I think that huge door, I guess. Yeah, it's a door in the floor door. He put that over the waterfall because you open it in the summer and the stream comes in and you just feel the cool air as you're standing in there. That's beautiful because it's functional. It's beautiful because, he just looked at exactly what would be the best house for this exact spot and for this exact family. Now it's beautiful. And I think you could say the same for the symbiotic relationship between men and women and what is going to feel good for us and good for the opposite sex. Another thing that happened this past week, and I want to talk about briefly, I don't know how brief this is going to be, but we saw a meteor. How cool is that? We saw a freaking meteor. We saw it burn up, so I guess we were driving, it must have been about 4,000 feet we were driving. I guess it must have been north on State Route, 89, I think? State Route 89 at about 4,000 feet. It was dusk, and I think at about, I would say 3,000 or 4,000 feet. So we were at 4,000 feet elevation. So it was probably 7,000 or 8,000 feet elevation. We see this thing just coming down at an angle, and I all I can say is thing. At first, it looked like an airplane crashing, but then it burned up. It kind of split into pieces and burnt up, and boy. That's a cool... I've never seen that. I know last month we were at Joshua Tree and we saw the Perseids. That was cool. But, that's kind of expected. A Perseid meteor shower just looks like a beam of light over there. But this really looked like something coming in from outer space. Like it just made it... It was so much more evocative than the Perseids at night. And yeah, it was at dusk, I think, so it was still kind of light out. And you could see it burn up, kind of split in two pieces and dissolve. And, it really... I mean, it's just amazing. I guess it's a powerful feeling, like looking at the Milky Way, for instance, or looking at the Perseids, or just whenever you're out camping somewhere, when the sky's clear, no light pollution. It really makes you think, oh, there's this whole other world out there that, as exemplified by the meteor, it can totally affect us, and we know that it has. I guess it's like looking at your unconscious in a way, like, oh, this is why I'm doing. This is what's ultimately in control. Maybe a kind of atonement with the Father. In the first and second and part of the third act, you're working on something that you think is most important. Then this thing shows up, this meteor in this story. It's like, oh no, this is actually the most important thing. What this indicates, the possibility of a asteroid or comet, impacting Earth, which we have evidence for. We have evidence for this happening, of course, at the dinosaur extinction, but now more and more evidence is coming out. I can't say anything too definite about it, of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a comet that hit the North American ice sheet about 12,000 years ago. These things happen, and they happen at a pretty regular interval, and there's a reason for that. I don't want to get into it, but yeah, kind of makes you think, like that's a great way to, I don't know, motivate somebody or wake somebody up. I mean, that's a popular, like, maybe self-help kind of motivational thing to say is, if somebody's just wasting their time on Twitter or YouTube all day and not really doing what they want with their life, the popular thing to tell them is the train is coming. It's coming. Something's coming. Now, ultimately, the train that's coming is death. You're going to be on your deathbed in 40, 50, 60 years, if you're lucky. Best case scenario, you're going to be on your deathbed in 60 years. And you know that the end is nigh. How are you preparing for that moment? What does that moment mean to you? What is what you're doing today? And I know this is maybe, getting a little bit heavy, but I think is really important. What is that moment? How are you preparing for that moment right now? And it's going to come sooner than that. There's going to be health issues. Family members are going to get sick. Somebody's going to need money, and you're going to need to lend to them, or at least have a conversation about that, or something serious is going to happen. You're going to lose your job. If you have a company, clients are going to stop showing up for the same reason. You have to constantly change and evolve. The train is coming. How are we preparing right now for when that train is coming? And this is what I was going back to. Like, I don't know if the universe or God's plan, it's all going in the positive or negative direction. It doesn't matter. I do know that when you become more aware of your psyche, I think this is part of what it means to become more aware of your psyche, is realizing that these things are coming. I mean, the guy who wakes up in the morning to work out, why does he do it? Well, I guess there could be a bunch of reasons. But maybe he's thinking, if I don't have a perfect six-pack, then I'm unlovable. Okay, that would maybe be unhealthy, but a healthier reason would be, look, I know these bad health things are coming. Look, I've got diabetes in my family, so I got to watch my sugar intake. He's aware. Yeah, that's all it is. He's aware. He knows that the train is coming. And he's not scaring himself. I mean, it's real. And I think seeing a meteor and knowing what can happen with the KT extinction, with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the train for humanity is, there are huge balls of rock and ice out there floating around that get disturbed for whatever reason. Again, don't have to go into it, and they're more likely to hit Earth. And when they do, and it's not a matter of if, right? It's a matter of when. When they do, we got to be prepared. What are we doing? And of course, I can make an argument, critical race theory, everybody arguing about whose identity is more victimized than another's, or the presidential debates. How are we distracting ourselves? We're distracting ourselves. It's like, no, but the train, the meteor, the asteroid, the comet, it's coming, right? I was actually just reading, I'm gonna get this, 1 second. So I finished reading the Divine Comedy. I got Ovid Metamorphoses here. There's actually a quotation, and that's what he's talking about. He's talking about, where is it? Oh boy, I don't know how they. There's no line numbers on this, so it was part of book 1. Guys, I'm totally going to find this. I think it was at the top of the left page. Okay, yeah, here we go. So this is Ovid describing history up until now. Like in the beginning of Metamorphosis, he's invoking the gods. I don't know, some kind of spiritual invocation, spirituality, right? How do we inspire us? Literally inspire, fill ourselves up with breath. And so he's talking about the history of the world and, how we went through a golden age, a silver age, then an iron age. And then as punishment, Jove, the gods, Jove, quote, raised a thunderbolt against the earth and checked the blow. Would heaven break in fire and flames pour over earth from pole to pole? Yeah, that's what an asteroid looks like when it's coming in. It looks like this huge thing of fire. I mean, that's what the little meteor that we saw, it was like burning up. You could see it was on fire. Is he describing possible remnants? I mean, Ovid did have access to the Library of Alexandria. Were there possible remnants of an ancient history of there being a comet? I guess in this case, a comet. We know it was a comet. If there's truth to that Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, it was a comet. Were there records at this time of a comet that were lost in the Library of Alexandria? And then he goes on. Jove then remembered that the fates had scored a certain distant hour when sea and land, earth and the vault of heaven would be consumed in universal fire. Which, that's what would happen, right? If there was an impact here, a lot of energy, huge fire. He put aside the lightning spear, Cyclopean hands made as his weapon to assert his will. Another doom for man came to his mind, a death that stormed beneath the waves, fell from the air, and then dark rain began to fall. So there was fire, and then there was a flood. That's what would happen. Right? Is that what Ovid is talking about? I don't know. These things are coming. And what are we doing? I think this is part of what spirituality is. My Jungian professor at my old graduate school, that was his way of encapsulating spirituality, of him explaining what spirituality is in a very simple way. It was like, I was kind of making fun of it. I called it the Independence Day argument for spirituality. It's what would happen if an alien spaceship, not violent, just an alien spaceship landed on Earth. What would that do to your psyche? Well, you would start calling yourself an Earthling, for one thing. I'm not going to make some, we're all in this together, we're all one, kumbaya kind of argument. But you would start thinking of yourself as an Earthling. You would start thinking of yourself in a way more connected to people who you would think maybe on the surface are a little bit more different than you. That's what you're thinking now. Though they're more different than me, I don't really identify with them. You would start identifying with them. Really quick. Start to figure out our similarities and how we talk about those. That's, in a sense, spirituality. But I think the meteor coming down does something quite similar. And I'm checking the time here. Okay, I think we got some time. Got this. Oh, crap. Don't mind me if you're just listening to this. I'm futzing away. Now, why isn't this going in? Try not to hit the stop button. Okay. So yeah, what was I talking about at the beginning of this this episode? How do we do for consciousness what Freud did for sexuality? What do I want to do? Yeah, so what did Freud do for sexuality? He extrapolated it out. He made it mean something in a way that's not only, hey, this thing over here, sexuality is really important, but he talked about it in a way that is made it important for our psychology. People are always criticizing Jung, like, oh, you're saying that our children go through sexual stages. Oh, you're trying to sexualize our children, which of course we're very sensitive to, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be. But, that was the moralistic argument against Freud. Oh, children are sexual now? Okay, that's what... I don't really agree necessarily with Freud's stages of sexual development, but I think what he was doing in a sense is saying, look, sexuality matters. Why is it everybody comes into the clinic, I'm doing these word associations, everybody has a complex around sexuality. So, whether we wear a Victorian, essentially it was a Victorian burqa, or we have women wearing string bikinis, in a way they're both doing the same thing. The Victorian woman and the woman wearing the string bikini to the beach, they both have this, okay, I either have to repress the sexuality or express it. And Freud knew, if we repress it, then it's going to be expressed in a way that may be less unhealthy. I'm not saying don't wear a string bikini to the beach, but just using that example. Really, how do we create a dialogue? How do we dialogue about the space? the dialogue about the space with our bodies, this like SJW language. Okay, so we're just rehashing Marxism. How do we make it seem like we have original thoughts? I know, we'll just come up with new words for things. We'll call it dialoguing about bodies and spaces. And I think what our view was of sexuality 100 years ago, or now 120 years ago when Freud was writing this, I think is very similar to our views of consciousness now. We either have a total repression of consciousness, typically what you'll find in psychology academia circles saying, oh, consciousness doesn't matter, it's all about behavioral genetics, which I do think behavioral genetics matters. It's all about evolutionary psychology. Of course, I do think that's important, but it's only a part of it. Why are we focusing on the thing that we know we can't change? Right? I would argue, what's the complex there? And then on the other side, we have, self-help guys on, money guru Twitter saying, oh, just have positive thoughts. Just talk to yourself in a positive way. You can do anything you want. You can change anything you want about you. So we have the consciousness version here in the, the Victorian woman wearing the burqa, in a sense, to Yellowstone, and the woman wearing a string bikini to the beach. Either repression or total expression, both indicating maybe not the healthiest relationship with her sexuality, as opposed to maybe just a woman wearing a regular bathing suit to a beach and, oh, I'm going to put on sunscreen. This is going to be fun. This isn't about my body. It's just wearing what's comfortable for me. Why would I think about it beyond that? Very much like the Greeks in the first Olympics, running the 400 meter naked. Why wouldn't I run the 400 meter naked? I could think of a few reasons. A few discomfort reasons why I wouldn't want to run the 400 meter naked, but it's just that sense of, well, what's the problem? Right? I don't even see the issue here. Like that old South Park episode where the South Park flag was a bunch of white stick figures lynching a black stick figure, and Chef was getting really upset about it. He's like, oh, how could you support this? And then Stan and Kyle, the kids, they were like, well, what's the problem with the flag? It just shows people lynching somebody else. And I was like, oh, how can you not see, that this is racist? Like, racism, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out the kids didn't even see the blackness of the stick figure being hanged or being lynched. And that's maybe like a healthier way. I know that's now a canceled view of, that colorblind, not literally colorblind, but just essentially treating race like it doesn't matter. I understand that. You can't express that in any kind of academia circles, but you could argue that would maybe be a healthier expression of race. And I think that's just like what the normal girl, normal guy, I'm just going to wear regular swim trunks to the beach. My body's fine. Maybe I have 5-10 pounds, but I'm not going to be ashamed about it. I'm not going to put it on display in any kind of self-aggrandizing way. To some extent, sure, if you're 22 and going to the beach is essentially the salmon of Capistrano, no. What is it of Capistrano? Who goes to Capistrano? Gulls? Not salmon. I think it's some kind of seagull. Goes to Capistrano in Southern California and mates. Salmon Capistrano. Anyway. I'm trying to quote Dumb and Dumber here, and I forget the exact line. I'm more embarrassed that I forget the line from Dumb and Dumber than I am embarrassed that I forget the animal that goes to San Juan Capistrano. It might be seagulls or something. Anyway, I'm going to look that up. So like how sexuality was repressed. Right? The Victorians obviously thought sexuality was really important. All these dictums, all this stigma around sexuality. You are in a sense saying that it's important. And that's what consciousness is now. I mean, I think consciousness is repressed, like the academes, like the materialists. It's controlled, fetishized by the positive psychologists. Oh, you can do anything you want. Just believe it and you'll become it. CBT, positive psychology kind of thing. And I think what we need to do is to do what Freud did with sexuality, just kind of extrapolate it out. Well, actually, there's stages to sexual development, and you have to go through certain stages, not for the purpose of becoming more sexual or becoming less sexual. Look, we are sexual. It's part of our psychology. It's part of our healthy functioning. If we want more self-control, and I don't know if Jung or Freud says this, but I know Jung says this a lot when he's talking about Freud. I mean, go read volume 4. It's Freud and Psychoanalysis. I mean, the best Freudian for a time, and I think even arguably later. I mean, Jung didn't disagree with much, but he just wanted to expound on what Freud was saying. I think the best Freudian was Jung. So a good way to learn about Freud is to read Jung, especially I would argue volume 4. He's like, look, this isn't about sexuality. This is just, how do we gain control of our life? How do we make decisions that we want to make? That's all Freud's talking about with sexuality. And if we're either repressing it, like the Victorian burqa, or putting it on exhibit for the sake of putting it on exhibit, nothing else, then there's a complex there. And how do we work through this complex? Well, it's going to take some stages. It's going to take these stages of sexual childhood development. You definitely can't molest children, that's for sure. In a lot of the cases, it turns out where people were coming in saying that they were molested as children, a lot of them ended up not being true. You could find that out through different word associations, amplification. But it doesn't matter. The point is, it's almost like they wanted it to be true, indicating that there is a complex there. Even if it's not physically real, it's psychically real. Like when people are in therapy and they say, well, this is how I remember this, this event with my dad. I don't know if it really happened, though. I don't know if it really happened this way. It's like, well, no, we're not in a court of law. It doesn't matter. The point is, you think it happened this way, and you have this emotional reaction because of that. It doesn't say anything about reality, but we're trying to figure out what's going on in your psyche. So it doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's about creating a better relationship with yourself. And if it did, in fact, happen another way, it's only by talking about the way you think it happened that we're going to get to that. So this is why I think stages of initiation or stages of adult development are so important, because this is in a sense saying, look, in order to develop and become more conscious, you have to, like you went through sexual stages, you need to go through, separating from the parents, solitude, work, friends, sexual initiation, emotional initiation. Right? What was I talking about at the beginning of the podcast? It's going to be difficult to really broach a secure connection with a woman when you're insecure with your sexuality. So what are you going to do if you're insecure with your sexuality? You're going to unconsciously use her for validation. Okay, you can read a bunch of manosphere blogs about how it's important to put your mission first, but unless you handle that that sexual insecurity, it's just not going to happen in that way. It's always going to be this complex. What we were talking about last week, this complex, that kind of what's it called? Short circuits your mind. There we go. Yeah, short circuits your mind. And you think you're focusing on reality, but really this complex, this sexual insecurity is being triggered. And like we say, women, God bless them, they're really great at sussing that out in us. And I think similarly, like there was a lot of sexual abuse, or just a lot of repression about sexuality. I think there's a lot of consciousness abuse, even in the pro-consciousness, the fetishized consciousness end of this spectrum. The positive psychology, whatever you believe you can do it, kind of view of consciousness. There's a lot of like CBT, like do this, don't do that, while at the same time recognizing that it does do something, that we do have some kind of control of our lives. Not total control, but we do have some kind of control. So there's a lot of abuse, right? Like there was a lot of sexual abuse. Oh, don't have this sex with this person. We don't approve. Oh, they come from a different status, or they're a different race. Don't have sex with them. We don't approve. A lot of these do this, don't do that. Not what do you want? What would be good for you based on your values, based on your emotional awareness? Very much like Yeah, canonized. like couples fighting on vacation canonized in Mountain of Madness. I mean, I think this year was canonized in Bart's Inner Child with Brad Goodman, right? Get confident, stupid. Get confident, stupid. I mean, that is consciousness abuse. That is consciousness restriction. That is, at the same time, very much like our relationship with sexuality in Victorian times, saying, look, this matters, but you got to do what we say. And I think what I want to do with my emotional diagrams, with my stages of adult development and how we go from one to the next, what initiation looks like. I'm obviously not the first one to talk about that and why that's really important, but I think we have this idea like, oh, you just initiate once and then you become a man. I mean, maybe if we were living in hunter-gatherer tribes, that was maybe a helpful way to go about it, or maybe that was good enough, but not anymore. You have to keep going through stages of initiation. You got to keep initiating yourself emotionally, sexually. I'm not going to talk about it too much now. I think it's probably time is up, right? Yeah, that's time. But, that's what we're doing here. Just how do we create a better relationship with our consciousness, with the very accurate idea that we do have free will, and that we can control our lives to some extent. How do we create a better relationship with that? Well, what we do is we tease it out, like we did with sexuality. And I have ways of doing that, ways of working with your psychology, so that process will happen in a lot easier way, hopefully a lot quicker. animusempire.com/schedule. We do free 30-minute consultations. If you have any questions for the show, animus@animusempire.com. Love to hear from you guys, just see what you're going through. That's really helpful for you, I think, and it's going to be helpful for me. And I'll leave it there. Consciousness, pain, reality. I want you to have all those things.